Father is always choosing you. I hate you. I deserve the Duke and not you. Help me! Stop! Stop!
In 1800s England, a title was not just a name. A title was your future, your children's future. The air you breathed, the chair you sat in at dinner, the way other people's eyes moved when you entered a room. A title was everything. And some people, God help them, were willing to do anything to get one. Charlotte Ravenshire never asked for the attention she received. She never campaigned for her father's affection or angled for a nobleman's gaze. She simply lived, warmly, quietly, to kindly, and that was exactly what made her sister want to destroy her. One evening, in the stillness of the Eastmarch estate, two sisters walked to the lake together. Only one of them was meant to walk back. And for a long time, for many cold, agonizing months, everyone believed that was exactly what had happened. But on the day of the grandest engagement ceremony of the season, when candles blazed and champagne gleamed and silk rustled against polished floors, a figure appeared at the door, to wet, mud-stained, breathing, alive. Let me take you to the county of Eastmarch, England, in the autumn of 1842. The Ravenshire estate sat 3 miles from the nearest village, surrounded by elm trees that turned copper and gold every October like they were trying to show off. The manor itself was grand. 3 floors of pale stone, tall windows that caught the morning light just so, gardens tended by 7 groundskeepers who worked quietly and never looked directly at the Duchess unless spoken to first. That was the rule. There were many rules at Eastmarch. His Grace Christopher Dominic Ravenshire, Duke of Eastmarch, was a man of deep principle and quiet warmth, the kind of man who remembered the names of every servant on his estate and asked after their families at Christmas. He was not a man who shouted. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to still a room. His hair had begun to silver at the temples, and it suited him the way authority always suits a man who earned it honestly. He was well liked among the nobility, well respected among his peers, and privately, among the staff, considered the finest employer in 3 counties. He had 2 daughters. The elder was Eliana Ravenshire, 21 years old, with sharp, dark eyes, perfectly dressed hair, and a regal posture that she had practiced so thoroughly it no longer looked practiced at all. But Eliana wore her beauty like a weapon she had spent years sharpening. She moved through rooms the way certain people do, expecting them to part for her, and usually being right. Her gowns were always the finest, her jewels always the newest, her opinions always the loudest, though she had learned to make them sound like observations rather than demands. The staff feared her more than they feared the Duchess, which was saying something. The younger was Charlotte Ravenshire, 19 years old. Where Eliana was sharp, Charlotte was soft. Where Eliana collected admirers like they were ornaments, Charlotte collected small, forgettable kindnesses. A warm word to the kitchen maid, a spare shawl left on a cold bench for the boy who polished the silver, an extra candle slipped under the door of the seamstress who worked late. Charlotte was not plain. She was lovely in that unassuming way that takes a moment to notice, and then becomes impossible to unsee. Brown hair, quick, bright eyes, a face that told you exactly what she was feeling, because she had never learned to hide it. The servants adored her, her father adored her, and this quiet, undeserved adoration was the stone that had been sitting in Eliana's shoe for 19 years. Now the Duchess, Lady Melissa Ravenshire, was a woman of considerable elegance and very little warmth. She had been beautiful once, in the way that cold things are sometimes beautiful, and she had never quite forgiven the world for the years that followed. She wore her disappointments the way other women wore pearls, close to the throat, always visible, occasionally choking. She loved Eliana with a ferocity that had nothing gentle in it. She loved Eliana the way a person loves a mirror, because what she saw there reflected back everything she wished she had been. Charlotte she tolerated, on the better days. This is important, and let me be direct with you. Lady Melissa's cruelty toward her younger daughter was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet. It was the sigh when Charlotte spoke at dinner. It was the way she distributed praise like a woman rationing bread. Plenty for Eliana, none for anyone else. It was the remark, delivered with a small smile, that Charlotte's hair would look better pinned, or that her posture was not what it ought to be, or that perhaps she should not speak so freely with the servants, because it confused the natural order of things. Charlotte heard all of it, absorbed all of it, and kept being kind anyway. That is the first lesson this story teaches us. Cruelty does not always come with a raised voice and clenched fists. Sometimes it arrives in silk gloves, with a practiced smile, and it does its damage so quietly that the person being hurt begins to wonder if they are imagining it. If you are sitting with someone right now who makes you feel small, who withholds warmth like it costs them personally, pay attention to this story, because kindness is not weakness, and endurance is not the same as acceptance. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It genuinely means the world to me. This channel runs on your support, and it is essential that we get it through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, and I have a feeling it is, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It helps more than you will ever know. All right. Thank you. Now let us get back to the story. It was a Tuesday in late October when His Grace Charles Henry, Duke of Bedford, arrived at the Eastmarch estate with his son, Lord Charles Montford, Marquess of Bedford, 24 years old, the heir to one of the finest titles in England, was not the sort of man who made a fuss about himself. He was tall, well built in the quiet way that suggests purpose rather than vanity, with dark eyes that observed more than they revealed, and a manner that managed to be both composed and entirely genuine. The servants who took his coat at the door that first evening noted privately that he thanked them, not with a nod, actually thanked them by name after learning it. But that detail spread through the kitchen in under an hour. The Duke of Bedford and the Duke of Eastmarch were old friends, had been since their university years, bound by the kind of loyalty that only forms when men are young and still know how to be honest with each other. The visit had been arranged weeks in advance. Officially, it was a social call, but everyone in both households understood the real purpose. The Duke of Bedford's son needed a wife, and the Duke of Eastmarch had 2 daughters. As the first evening passed pleasantly, dinner by candlelight, fine wine, conversation about Parliament and the harvest, and the progress of the northern railways. Charlotte sat quietly at the far end of the table, listening more than speaking, as she tended to do. Eliana positioned herself near Lord Montford with the precision of a chess player moving her most important piece, laughing at exactly the right moments and asking questions she already knew the answers to, but because she had discovered years ago that men who feel heard are men who feel admired. Lord Montford was polite to Eliana. He was kind to Charlotte. There is a difference between politeness and kindness, and it is not always obvious. But it was obvious to Charlotte's father. It was obvious to the older kitchen maid, Alice Pay, who had been with the family for 14 years and watched everything from the doorway. and it was obvious, with a sickening clarity, to Lady Melissa. After dinner, while the men withdrew for port, Lady Melissa watched her elder daughter across the drawing room with narrowed eyes and the slow, calculating patience of a woman doing arithmetic. He smiled at her twice during the fish course, Eliana said quietly, her fan moving with careful idleness. He is well-mannered, Lady Melissa replied. It means nothing yet. He asked her about the garden. He did not ask me about the garden. Then tomorrow, her mother said, without raising her voice, you will be in the garden first. Charlotte, who had drifted to the window to look at the night sky above the elm trees, heard none of this. She was thinking about how the first frost had come earlier than expected this year, and whether the groundskeeper, old Joseph, who had a bad knee, had managed to cover the rose beds before the cold settled in. She made a note to ask him in the morning. She made a note to ask him herself, and not leave it to the junior staff who sometimes forgot. But that was Charlotte. Even in the drawing room of a house full of schemes, her mind went to the roses. The Bedford visit lasted 4 days. By the second afternoon, Lord Montfort had found reasons, natural, unforced reasons, which is the most telling kind, to speak with Charlotte 4 separate times. She had shown him the Eastmarch library, because he mentioned in passing that he enjoyed history, and she knew exactly where the best volumes were kept. She had introduced him to Joseph the groundskeeper, because Lord Montfort noticed the rose beds and asked about them with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. They had stood together in the pale October sunlight, while old Joseph explained the pruning schedule with the seriousness of a man discussing matters of state, and Lord Montfort had listened with exactly the same seriousness, and Charlotte had watched and felt something quiet and warm move through her chest that she could not entirely name. Eliana watched from the upper window. On the third evening, the two dukes sat together in the study. Firelight, brandy, the comfortable silence of old friends. And His Grace Charles Henry, Duke of Bedford, said what he had come to say. Your Charlotte is remarkable, he said. My son has not stopped thinking clearly since he met her, which in my experience is the only reliable sign of a thing worth pursuing. Christopher Ravenshire turned his glass in his hand. She is the best of us, he said simply. I will not pretend otherwise. Would you object to a formal proposal? Conducted properly, of course. Nothing rushed. I would not object, her father said. But I would ask that Charlotte be informed first. She is not furniture to be arranged. The Duke of Bedford smiled, the slow, approving smile of a man recognizing another man's good sense. Naturally. The next morning, His Grace Christopher Dominic Ravenshire called Charlotte to his study. She came in with a small notebook she had been using to record household accounts. She helped with the estate management, quietly, without being asked, because she noticed things that needed doing, and she sat in the chair across from her father, with the easy comfort of a daughter who has always felt safe in her father's presence, he told her. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. Not a frightened quiet, a thinking quiet. Lord Montfort himself? Not the Duke arranging something his son does not know about. The boy came to me directly this morning, her father said, before his father had a chance to. That tells you something about his character. Yes, Charlotte said softly. It does. She looked out the window at the elm trees. She thought about the rose beds. She thought about the way he had listened to old Joseph with complete and unperformed attention. She thought about 19 years of being invisible in the place she was supposed to be most seen, and how strange it felt, how frightening and also quietly wonderful to be chosen. I would like to know him better before anything is formalized, she said at last. But I am not opposed. Her father reached across the desk and covered her hand with his. Good, he said. That is the right answer. He did not tell Lady Melissa immediately. He should have. He would later wish he had, not because it would have changed what Melissa did, but because he would have liked to have seen her face when the news came from him, firmly, with no room for manoeuvring. Instead, Lady Melissa heard it from Alice Pay, who heard it from the footman, who had been in the hallway outside the study with an armful of firewood and a complete inability to move quietly. Melissa heard it, and something in her face went very still, the way water goes still just before it freezes. She went to find Eliana. Eliana's response, when her mother told her, was not a shout or a sob. It was worse than that. It was a long silence, and then a single word. No. Not no as in denial. No as in refusal. No as in, this is not how this ends. Lady Melissa sat across from her elder daughter in Eliana's private sitting room and watched that beautiful, calculating face rearrange itself from shock into something colder and more purposeful. She should have said something then. She should have taken her daughter's hands and said, Eliana, this is life. Sometimes we do not get what we want. Sometimes the world does not arrange itself around our desires, and the dignified thing, the human thing, is to accept it and find another path. Yet she did not say any of that. Instead, she leaned forward in her chair and lowered her voice, and she said, There are ways to change what has been decided. And so the lesson arrives again, harder this time, a mother's love when it is disordered, when it is really self-love reflected in a child, does not protect. It amplifies. Every impulse, every grievance, every dangerous idea that a young person might have entertained and abandoned on their own, a mother like Melissa will water it, feed it, and call the result devotion. The plot they formed over the following days was not dramatic in its construction. That is the terrifying truth of real malice. It rarely looks like a villain's monologue. It looked like two women talking quietly in a sitting room. It looked like a stroll to the lake, arranged with a casual suggestion. It looked like Eliana going to Charlotte's room 3 evenings later, with a soft expression and a small gift. A hair ribbon, pale blue, of the kind of gesture that costs nothing and is designed to cost nothing, designed purely to open a door that had been slowly closing. I have been unkind to you, Eliana said, standing in Charlotte's doorway. I know it. I am sorry. Charlotte looked at her sister for a moment. There was something in Eliana's eyes that she could not quite read, a brightness that might have been tears, or might have been something else entirely. Charlotte, who believed in people with the straightforward hopefulness of someone who had not yet been sufficiently punished for it, stepped back and let her sister in. There is nothing to apologize for, she said, which was generous to the point of being untrue. But Charlotte had never known how to be otherwise. Come to the lake with me tomorrow evening, Eliana said. Just us. Like when we were small. I have missed you. Charlotte looked down at the ribbon in her hands. Pale blue. Soft. She should have felt the wrongness of it. She almost did. There was a flicker, some small interior voice that cleared its throat and started to speak. But Eliana's expression was so open, so seemingly earnest, and Charlotte was 19 years old and had spent most of those years hoping her sister would come to the door with exactly this kind of offering. All right, she said. Tomorrow evening. She did not tell her father. She did not mention it to Alice Pay. She simply went. That the evening of the 15th of November, 1842, was cold and clear. The kind of evening that looks beautiful from a window, but bites when you step into it, Frost already threatening the grass, the sky a deep bruised purple above the tree line, the estate lake lying flat and dark and still as a mirror that reflects nothing comfortable. Charlotte wore her blue silk evening gown. It was the nicest thing she had worn in days, because Eliana had suggested it with that new warmth she was displaying. And Charlotte hadn't wanted to disappoint. Her brown hair was down, loose around her shoulders. She carried no candle. The moon was enough. They walked to the lake together, two sisters in the dark, and for a few minutes, a very few, it was almost what Eliana had promised. They spoke of small things, the cold, a memory from childhood, the way the frost made the grass crunch underfoot. Charlotte laughed once, a real laugh, at something Eliana said about their old governess, and for that one moment she was completely unguarded, completely present, completely herself. Then Eliana stopped at the edge of the water. Charlotte stopped beside her. The lake was dark. The estate lights were very far away. "Eliana," Charlotte said, because something had changed. The quality of the silence, the way her sister was standing, very still, facing the water rather than her. "What is it?" "Father chose you," Eliana said. Her voice was flat. The warmth was gone from it entirely, like a candle snuffed. "Lord Montford, Bedford, everything. He chose you." "We have not decided anything yet," Charlotte said carefully. She could feel her heart beginning to move faster. She took a half step back. "Eliana, let us go inside. It is cold." She did not finish the sentence. The water was black and it was shockingly, viciously cold. Charlotte did not scream immediately. Shock stole the sound first, and then the cold stole her breath, and then she was fighting. Arms, legs, the terrible weight of wet silk dragging at her, and above her, standing at the edge of the lake, Eliana looked down with an expression that Charlotte would not be able to describe afterward because she did not have the language for it. It was not hatred. It was almost worse than hatred. It was resolution. Charlotte fought. She was not a strong swimmer. She had never learned properly. But survival is its own instructor, and she fought toward the edge, gasping, reaching, or fingers clawing at the mud bank. Eliana watched for a moment that stretched. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. Charlotte's fingers slipped. The cold took her. Aidan Jackson had worked on the Eastmarch estate for 11 years. He was a quiet man, not shy, but economical with words in the way that people are when they have spent most of their lives outdoors, where the work speaks for itself, and silence is not uncomfortable. He was strong in the practical, unhurried way of someone who moves stone and timber and earth for a living. He had an honest face, the kind that is difficult to lie to, with steady grey eyes that noticed things other people missed because other people were too busy talking. He had been checking the north fence line by the lake that evening, a section of fencing that had been weakening for weeks, and that he had finally gotten around to repairing, even though it was cold and the light was going, when he heard the splash. Or he thought at first it was a deer. Then he heard something that was not the sound a deer makes, and he was moving before his mind had finished the thought, down the bank and into the shallows, and his hands found her before his eyes did. A weight, a tangle of sodden blue silk, a face that had gone the color of frost. He pulled her out. He laid her on the grass and pressed the water from her lungs with the methodical calm of a man whose panic has been fully redirected into purpose. And she coughed, a horrible, wrenching sound, and breathed. She was barely conscious. He did not recognize her immediately. The darkness, the state of her, the mud. But when the moonlight shifted and he saw her face, recognition arrived with a weight that sat heavily in his chest. Miss Charlotte, the young mistress. He could have carried her directly to the house. He almost did. But something made him slow, some instinct he could not have articulated in that moment. And he thought about the fact that someone had done this. This did not happen by accident. She was in an evening gown at the lake in November. Someone had been there. And if he brought her back to the house, and the wrong person saw her first. He thought fast. He thought of Luke Nichols, the physician who lived in the village, or who had been a decent and principled man in every interaction Aidan had ever had with him. He carried her 2 miles in the dark. When Charlotte did not appear for breakfast the next morning, the household assumed she had slept late. By midday, the assumption had become concern. By evening, His Grace Christopher Ravenshire had every man on the estate searching the grounds. By the end of the 3rd day, soldiers from the village had been engaged. The lake was dredged. The surrounding woodland was combed. Every road within 10 miles was watched. Nothing. No body, no note, no witness. Eliana performed her grief with a thoroughness that was almost impressive, almost, because Alice Pay, who had known both girls since they were infants, watched Eliana's tears with the quiet attentiveness of a woman who has spent 40 years reading people, and found them slightly too perfectly timed. But Alice Pay had no proof and no power, and so she said nothing and watched and waited with the patient grief of the truly helpless. Lady Melissa managed the household with brisk efficiency and very little visible emotion, which everyone attributed to the stoic suffering of a mother too proud to break publicly, and which was something else entirely. The Duke of Eastmarch aged visibly in those weeks. The silver at his temples seemed to spread overnight. He sat in his study for long hours, the estate accounts open and unread before him, and he did the thing that all parents who lose children do. He went over every moment, every conversation, every evening, searching for the thing he missed, the choice he could have made differently that would have changed the outcome. He could not find it. He never would. His Grace Charles Henry, Duke of Bedford, came personally when he heard the news. He arrived with Lord Montfort, who had gone quiet in the way that some men do when something has struck them much deeper than they were prepared for. The young lord stood in the Eastmarch garden for a long time on the afternoon of his arrival, looking at the rose beds that were now bare and frost-bitten, and Joseph the old groundskeeper, whose bad knee had kept him indoors during the search, came and stood beside him without a word, and they stood there together in the cold for several minutes, saying nothing, which was its own kind of conversation. 2 months passed, then 3. The Duke of Bedford, distressed by his friend's grief and pressed by practical matters of succession and propriety that would not wait forever, broached the subject of the engagement being redirected. His Grace Christopher Ravenshire, dulled by loss and not thinking clearly, agreed in a grey and distant way that suggested he would have agreed to almost anything, and that he regretted it before the month was out. But the engagement was shifted to Eliana, and Eliana accepted with a composure that should have been suspicious, and a smile that should have been questioned, and absolutely no one asked the questions that needed to be asked. This is the second lesson. Grief blinds. When a family is devastated, when the people who should be asking hard questions are submerged in sorrow, criminals find their opening. If you ever find yourself in the position of observing a tragedy from the outside, look carefully, but ask the questions gently but honestly. The guilty will always be the ones who are moving forward while everyone else is standing still. Luke Nichols had been a physician for 16 years. He had seen injuries that had no polite explanation before. He had treated women who had fallen, he was told, down staircases, with marks that staircases do not generally leave. He had learned, over those 16 years, to treat the person first and ask the careful questions later, and to write down everything, because documentation is the ally of justice in a world where power tends to protect itself. When Aidan Jackson arrived at his door at 11 o'clock on a November night, with a half-drowned girl in his arms, Luke Nichols did not ask a single unnecessary question. He opened the door wider and said simply, "Bring her in." The recovery was long. Charlotte had inhaled water, and her lungs took weeks to settle. She had hypothermia so severe that Luke would say later it was only the youth and fundamentally strong constitution of the girl that pulled her through. She slept for the better part of the first 10 days, deep, exhausted sleep, broken by coughing and fever. And occasionally a sharp cry in the dark that brought Luke and his housekeeper to the door of the spare room with a speed that suggested they had been listening for it. When she woke properly, truly woke, eyes clear, what mind present. It was the beginning of December. Aidan Jackson was there. He came every second day on the pretext of errands in the village and sat with her for the half hour Luke allowed and did not say very much. But his presence was solid and uncomplicated in a way that Charlotte, who had been surrounded for most of her life by complicated people, found unexpectedly steadying. Luke told her, gently, what Aidan had pieced together about the situation at the estate, that she was believed dead, that the household was in mourning, that no one had come looking in the direction of the village physician, which told its own uncomfortable story about who might have wanted her not found. Charlotte listened to all of it. She was quiet for a long time. "My sister," she said at last. Not a question. Luke said nothing. He straightened the instruments on his tray with unnecessary precision. "And my mother knew," Charlotte said. Still Luke said nothing, but his hands paused. "What is happening at the estate?" she asked. Luke told her about the engagement. Charlotte absorbed this. Her face went through several things that she did not try to hide. Grief, something slow and cold that was not quite anger. And then, eventually, a quiet settling, like a person who has decided something. "I'm going to need a few more weeks," she said, "and then I am going home." "Charlotte," Aidan began. "I am going home," she said again, with a calm that was more final than shouting. "I am going home, and I am going to tell the truth, and then whatever happens will happen." She looked at the window. Grey December sky, bare branches, ordinary village life going on beyond the glass. "My sister cannot keep something she took by force," she said, "and my father deserves to know what was done in his own house." Aidan Jackson looked at Luke Nichols. Luke Nichols looked at his instruments. They had both been hoping she would say something like this, and they had both been slightly afraid she would, because a young woman alone returning to the home of the person who tried to kill her is not a plan without considerable risk. But Charlotte was not quite the same young woman who had walked to the lake in November in a silk gown and a moment of naive hope, or 3 months of cold and fever and the specific education that comes from lying still for a long time with nothing to do but think, that changes a person. Not in their essence. Charlotte was still Charlotte, but she had learned that kindness without discernment is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability that other people with worse intentions will exploit every time you offer it. Back at Eastmarch, Eliana was not sleeping. This would surprise no one who understands how guilt operates. The guilt does not announce itself politely and wait to be invited in. It finds the gaps, the half-second between one thought and the next, the dark at the edge of a well-lit room, the surface of still water in a mirror or a glass. Guilt is extraordinarily patient and never leaves voluntarily. Eliana had not expected to feel this way. She had planned the act with such focused determination that there had been no room in her thoughts for what would come after, and she had assumed that once Charlotte was gone, the rest would simply arrange itself, settle. Like furniture rearranged in a room, it might look different for a moment, but you would adjust. She hadn't adjusted. She saw Charlotte's face in the lake. She saw it in mirrors briefly, when the candlelight was wrong. She heard a sound in the night that was sometimes the wind, and sometimes her own breathing, and occasionally, and this was the worst, was something she could not explain at all. She had become sharp-tempered with the maids in a way that was noticed, and brittle with the engagement preparations in a way that Lord Montfort found quietly perplexing. He was kind to her. He was always kind, in his steady, unhurried way. He tried to draw her out at dinner with questions she could not quite focus on, because she was listening, always listening, for something she could not name. Her mother told her she was being dramatic. "You are letting sentiment slow you down," Lady Melissa said one morning, closing the door of Eliana's dressing room behind her. "What is done is done. The engagement proceeds in 3 weeks. I need you composed." "I see her," Eliana said. She said it without turning from the mirror. "At night, you see shadows," her mother replied, "because you are overtired and overwrought. Take the tonic Dr. James prepared. Sleep." "Mother," Eliana's voice cracked just slightly. "But if anyone were ever to—" "No one is going to anything," Lady Melissa said firmly, with a precision that suggested she had already considered and dismissed every relevant possibility. "Because no one knows, and no one will know. Now finish getting dressed. Lord Montfort is expected for luncheon, and I will not have you appearing at the table looking like you have not slept." She left. The door clicked shut with a soft, final sound. Eliana stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. She did not look the way she had expected to look on the other side of this. She had expected to look like a future Duchess. She looked instead like a woman being consumed from the inside, the eyes still sharp, but something behind them that had gone irregular, like a flame in a draught. The jewels at her throat were real and costly and somehow inadequate. She thought, not for the first time, that her mother had made her. She thought, also not for the first time, that she had let her. And that is the third lesson. The people who encourage our worst impulses are not our friends, even if they are our family. Even if they love us, in their fashion. Especially then, perhaps. Because love that pushes you toward harm is not love acting as love should. It is love acting as ambition, and ambition is indifferent to the damage it leaves behind. Be careful whose voice you let in when you are standing at the edge of something irreversible. But make sure that voice is asking you not just what you want, but who you want to become. On the morning of the 3rd of February, 1843, the day of the engagement ceremony, Charlotte Ravenshire rose before dawn. She had been staying in the spare room at Luke Nichols's house for nearly 3 months. She was recovered, fully, physically recovered, though there were moments when the cold touched her in a way that she felt slightly too acutely, as a body memory that she suspected might stay with her for some time. She was thin, and her hair had grown longer and looser, and she had no grand dress to put on. Only the gown she had been found in, cleaned and mended, but still showing every mark of what had happened to it. The blue silk was water-stained at the hem. A seam at the left shoulder had been repaired with thread that was almost, but not exactly, the right color. You could see, if you looked, what it had been through. Charlotte looked at it for a moment and then put it on. She thought about changing it. She thought about arriving in something clean and unmarked, presenting herself tidily and rationally. And then she thought, no, let them see what was done. Let the dress speak, if she is not given time to. Aidan Jackson drove her in a borrowed cart. They did not speak much on the journey. There was nothing much to say that had not already been said, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of silence between people who have been through something difficult together and have arrived at a mutual respect that does not require constant sound to maintain. Luke Nichols rode alongside because he had the documentation, a physician's written account of the injuries consistent with submersion, dated from the night of the 15th of November, signed in his neat and unambiguous hand, or he had written it the night Aidan brought her in. He had written it carefully. He had not known exactly what it would be used for or when, but he had known it would be needed. It was a Tuesday. The sun was pale, and the fields alongside the road were still frozen. Charlotte sat straight in the cart and watched the Eastmarch estate resolve out of the winter landscape as they approached. The pale stone, the tall windows, the elm trees stripped bare now, all their autumn gold long gone. She said nothing. She breathed. She was not afraid. She was something more useful than afraid. The Eastmarch ballroom had been dressed magnificently. Chandelier light blazed across crystal and silver. 24 candelabras lined the walls. The floor had been waxed to a mirror shine. The orchestra occupied the far end in formal arrangement, the first violins already tuning softly. A sound like whispered anticipation. There were 40 guests. All the notable families of the county were come to witness the formal engagement of Lady Eliana Ravenshire to Lord Charles Montford, Marquis of Bedford. Eliana stood near the fireplace in a gown of midnight blue silk, chosen, Lady Melissa had announced, in honour of the season, which was February and cold. The gown was beautiful. Eliana was beautiful. And she was standing with the careful stillness of someone who is using a great deal of energy to appear relaxed. Lord Montford was at the far side of the room speaking to his father. He held a glass of champagne that he had not touched. He had been unaccountably, privately unsettled all morning in a way he could not explain to himself, as though the day had a quality he could not identify, a resonance like a held note, like something about to resolve. The ceremony was to begin at 2 o'clock. It was 1:57. The ballroom doors opened. Not dramatically. They did not crash or swing. They simply opened, as the way doors open when someone who has been walking toward them for a long time finally arrives and does not need to hurry any further. Charlotte came in. She was thinner than she had been. Her gown was marked and mended. Her hair was down, half undressed from the long, cold ride. There was mud at the hem of her skirt from the last half-mile, where she had stepped down from the cart before it reached the door and walked the rest of the way herself, but because she did not want to arrive any other way. She walked in and she stopped. The room stopped with her. 40 people held their breath simultaneously, which is its own extraordinary sound, a sound like a great clock pausing between ticks. Lord Montford's champagne glass lowered. His face went through something complex and rapid, and then settled into something very still and very certain. Eliana's colour left her entirely. She made a sound. Not a word. No, something below a word. And her hand went to the back of a nearby chair. Lady Melissa's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of expression. His Grace Christopher Dominic Ravenshire, Duke of Eastmarch, who had been crossing the room toward the Master of Ceremonies, stopped in the middle of the floor and could not move, and could not speak, because the human body when it receives information it was not prepared for, requires a moment to redistribute itself. Or Charlotte looked at her father first, only at her father, for a long moment. And then she spoke, and her voice was quiet and clear, and carried to every corner of the silent room the way only the truth can. "I am Charlotte Ravenshire," she said. "And I did not drown. I was pushed into the lake on the evening of the 15th of November by my sister, Eliana. I have a physician's testimony, dated from the night I was found, and a witness who pulled me from the water. I am standing here because I survived what was done to me, and because my father and this assembly deserve to know what happened in this house." The silence after this was absolute. Then Eliana said, very quietly, "No." And then she said it again, and again, and the word dissolved into something that was not quite weeping and not quite denial, but was somewhere between the two. The sound of a woman confronting, in a ballroom full of witnesses, at everything that she had done and everything she had become, and the full distance between the person she was now and the person she might have chosen to be. Lady Melissa said nothing at all. She sat down in a nearby chair, with the careful precision of a woman managing a fall in slow motion, and her face arranged itself into the kind of blankness that is itself a confession. Lord Montford set down his champagne glass on the nearest surface, crossed the room in 14 strides, and stood before Charlotte. He looked at her face, at the marks of what she had been through, at the blue silk gown with its mended seam, at the mud on the hem and the steadiness in her eyes. And he said nothing for a moment, because he was a man who knew when words would be insufficient. Then he simply offered her his hand. Charlotte looked at it. Then she looked at him. She took it. The Duke of Eastmarch crossed the room and reached his daughter, and when he took her into his arms he made a sound that no one in that room would ever forget. The sound of a man who has been given back something he believed was gone forever. Several of the guests looked away, because some emotions are too private even for a public moment. The engagement ceremony ended without an engagement, but the guests dispersed into the winter afternoon with the expressions of people who have just witnessed something that will be discussed at every dinner table in the county for the next 20 years. The musicians packed their instruments with unusual speed. The champagne was left untouched on its trays. Luke Nichols presented his documentation to the Duke of Eastmarch and the Duke of Bedford jointly in the study, but with the measured calm of a professional who has done everything correctly and knows it. Aidan Jackson gave his account, straight, unembellished, factual, in the same room, standing with his cap in his hands and his grey eyes steady. The constable from the village arrived within the hour. He was a large, slow-moving man named Brandon Collier, who had the misleadingly drowsy manner of someone who is in fact paying very careful attention to everything, and he took statements from 5 people in the course of the afternoon with the methodical efficiency of a man who has seen enough of the world to be unsurprised by most of it, though even he paused for a moment when he read Luke Nichols' physician's notes. Eliana was arrested before supper time. She did not resist. By the time Constable Collier came to the yellow drawing-room where she had been sitting since the ballroom emptied, she had the look of a woman from whom all resistance had already drained away. The posture deflated, the sharp eyes gone dull, the practiced composure reduced to its bare bones. She stood when asked to stand. She walked when asked to walk. She said nothing. At the door of the room, she stopped once and looked back. Her mother was sitting in the chair by the window, upright, hands folded in her lap, not meeting her daughter's eyes. That was the moment, the specific, terrible moment, when Eliana understood that she had been entirely alone in what she had done, despite believing the opposite. Lady Melissa had encouraged, suggested, and watched. She had lit the fire, and then she had stepped away from it. And now the fire was out, and the burning had only ever been Eliana's. She turned away and walked out of the room. Lady Melissa was brought before the local magistrate, the Honourable John James, a serious man of 60, with no tolerance for social delicacy when the law was plainly involved, 2 days later. The evidence against her was circumstantial but cumulative. Witness accounts of her demeanour, the testimony of Alice Pay regarding what she had seen and heard over years in the household, the documented timeline of events. She was not charged with attempted murder. For that, the evidence pointed unambiguously to Eliana, but with conspiracy and the knowing concealment of a crime. Her punishment was a formal conviction, a heavy fine that depleted a significant portion of her personal estate, and a period of house arrest that lasted 14 months. She was not imprisoned because of her status and age and the complexity of the charges, and because the law in 1843 was, as it has always been, somewhat more sympathetic to those with property. But her reputation was destroyed, which in the world of the English nobility was its own particular sentence. Or the drawing rooms she had moved through freely for 20 years were closed to her. The invitations stopped. The social architecture she had spent her life constructing dismantled itself quietly and thoroughly in the weeks after the trial. She aged quickly. She blamed Eliana for everything, privately, and in letters that Eliana was eventually shown by her solicitor, which was perhaps the cruelest detail in an episode that had no shortage of candidates for that position. What Eliana was tried at the county assizes in March. She was convicted of grievous assault and the attempted deprivation of life, and sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment at the county jail. She served 4 of them, the final year commuted for conduct. She was released in the spring of 1847, a woman of 25, into a world that had thoroughly rearranged itself without her. She never returned to Eastmarch. Charlotte spent 3 days in bed after the engagement ceremony, which was the first time in 3 months that anyone had insisted she rest, and she had not felt compelled to argue about it. Her father sat with her for most of those 3 days, in the chair by the window of her childhood room, and they talked, more honestly, more completely, than they had ever talked before. He asked questions he should have asked years earlier about what life in the house had been like for her, and she answered with a gentleness that he did not deserve, but that was characteristic of her, and there were long silences that were not uncomfortable but necessary. Alice Pay brought broth and biscuits with a frequency that suggested she was using the function of nurse to compensate for years of being unable to protect the girl she had always wanted to protect, and Charlotte let her, because she understood that people who love us need to be useful, especially after they have been helpless. My Lord Montfort called on the 4th day. He was shown to the library, which is where he had asked to wait, because he thought she might find the library less formal than the drawing room. She came downstairs in a plain morning dress, with her hair properly pinned for the first time in months, and she found him standing at the shelves exactly where she had left him all those months ago. The history section, the same wall, his attention on the same general cluster of volumes that he had been examining during the visit that had changed everything. She stopped in the doorway. He turned. He looked at her the way he had been wanting to look at her for 3 months, which is to say with the full attention of someone who had gone a long time without something they had only just realized was necessary. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for agreeing to the engagement with Eliana." "You were grieving?" "Not everyone was," Charlotte said. She came into the room and sat in the chair she had sat in before, the one across from the window, with the winter light coming through the glass at that particular angle that she had always liked. "I should have asked more questions," he said. "I was too willing to accept what I was told." That is on me. You were not the only one, she said. My father was. Alice was. Half the county was. People in grief are not thinking clearly, and people with something to hide know this and use it. She paused. Aidan and Luke were the ones who asked the right questions, the ones who were not in the house. Lord Montfort was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Are you?" he began, and then started the question again. "How are you?" Charlotte looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the elm trees were still bare, but there was something in the sky, a particular quality of pale, more tentative light, that suggested spring was forming somewhere on the horizon, still weeks away but no longer absent. "I am well," she said, and it was honest. "I am genuinely well." They spoke for 2 hours that afternoon in the library, about books, about the estate, about nothing in particular, which is the best kind of conversation for the first proper day of something new. He made her laugh twice. She made him think once, clearly and hard, that about something he had held an easy assumption about for years. When he left, he stopped at the door and turned back, and his expression said several things that his words had not yet caught up to. "I would like to call again tomorrow," he said. "If that is acceptable." "That would be acceptable," Charlotte said. He called the next day, and the day after that. The formal engagement of Charlotte Ravenshire to Lord Charles Montfort, Marquis of Bedford, was announced in the 3rd week of February, to 1843, 14 days after the scene in the ballroom. It was not a ceremony, that announcement. It was a letter from the Duke of Bedford to the Duke of Eastmarch, and a corresponding letter from Charlotte's father to hers, and a notice in the County Gazette that was approximately 4 lines long and contained no drama whatsoever, which the entire county read with very great drama indeed. The wedding was in May of 1843, or when the elm trees at Eastmarch had finally recovered from winter and were covered in the sort of new green that looks almost unreal, the colour of possibility, of things beginning again. The rose beds were blooming. Joseph the groundskeeper had outdone himself. The East Garden was spectacular in a way that suggested he had put in some additional weeks of effort once he heard there would be a wedding, which he denied completely when anyone mentioned it, and which was absolutely true. The ceremony was at the village church, simple, genuine, attended by everyone who mattered and no one who didn't. Charlotte wore ivory, which suited her far better than the elaborate fashions her mother had always suggested, and she wore her hair down, because she had decided this was who she was, and she was no longer adjusting herself downward to fit anyone's expectations. Lord Montfort, Charles, as she had begun to think of him, and sometimes to call him in private, was in the moments that were only theirs, stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune, and was doing his level best not to show it, because he thought it would look undignified, and was failing entirely, which made him look considerably more dignified than succeeding would have. His father wept. He wept quietly, with the efficiency of a man who has decided weeping is appropriate and would like to complete it with the minimum possible disruption, which made it slightly funnier than he intended, and Charlotte's father noticed and briefly lost his own composure in a different way, and Alice Pay, from the 3rd row, observed all of this with the satisfaction of a woman who has waited a long time for a particular piece of justice and is now watching it delivered in full. They were married, but the wedding breakfast lasted 6 hours, and was, by the consensus of everyone present, one of the finest the county had ever produced, which was the kind of compliment that in that world meant something, and several guests pointed out, with varying degrees of tact, that the champagne this time was actually drunk. 15 months after the wedding, Charlotte gave birth to a son. He arrived on a Tuesday in August, 1844, in the full blaze of a summer morning, and was named Christopher Charles, the first name for Charlotte's father, the second for his own, which was the kind of naming that announces, quietly but clearly, that a new family understands where it came from and who it owes. He had his mother's eyes and his father's chin, and was, according to Alice Pay, who had been brought to Bedford at Charlotte's personal insistence, and who was therefore present and entirely qualified to judge, at the finest-looking infant she had seen in 40 years of service, which was high praise from a woman who had seen many infants and held her opinions. His Grace Christopher Ravenshire, Duke of Eastmarch, arrived the same evening and held his grandson with the careful, enormous tenderness of a man who had thought he was done receiving good things and has discovered he was wrong. He sat by the window in the same quality of pale light that Charlotte had always associated with new beginnings, and he looked at this small, extraordinary face, and something in him that had been braced and guarded since November of 1842 finally, completely released. Aidan Jackson received, in recognition of his role in saving Charlotte's life, a permanent position as head of estate at Bedford, a promotion that came with significant increase in wages, his own cottage on the grounds, and the quiet but genuine respect of every member of the household, which is worth more in the long run than the wages. He accepted all of it with the same economy of words he brought to everything, and his grey eyes were calm and steady, and he went back to work. Luke Nichols was appointed physician to the Bedford household, a formal retainer that ensured his practice, which had previously been modest, became one of the most secure in the county. He continued to write everything down. He always would. In the autumn of 1845, Charles Montford's father, His Grace Charles Henry, Duke of Bedford, passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 64, a good death after a good life, with his son at his side. Lord Charles Montford became the Duke of Bedford, Charlotte Ravenshire, who had been pushed into a dark lake in November of 1842 by her own sister, who had spent 3 months in a physician's spare room watching winter through a small window, who had walked into a ballroom in a mended gown with mud on the hem, and her heart in her hands, and the truth in her mouth, became the Duchess of Bedford. And she was, by every account that came after, from the servants who served her, from the families she assisted, from the tenants of the Bedford estate, whose lives became measurably better under her management, from the women she helped through the small charitable society she established in 1846 for the education of girls in the county, exactly as good at it as you would expect a person to be when they have spent their whole life being kind without reward, and finally have the platform to make that kindness count. Before we close, let me ask you something. Did Charlotte's return give you that moment of justice you have been waiting for? Did this story make something in you sit up straight? If it did, your support means the world to this channel. Please subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Every comment, every like, every subscription helps us bring more stories like this one to life. Thank you. Genuinely, truly. Thank you. And so we leave Eastmarch, its frost-bitten lake, its elm trees, its ballroom now full of the right kind of music, and we carry with us the things this story asked us to understand. That cruelty is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet sigh at dinner, a withheld word of praise, a mother's voice in a sitting room saying, "There are ways to change what has been decided." That grief blinds, and those who mean harm know this and use it. So look carefully when the people around you cannot. that the voice you listen to when you are standing at the edge of something irreversible will shape everything that comes after. Choose it wisely. That kindness is not weakness. That survival is its own kind of strength. That truth, however long it is kept underwater, will always, eventually, surface. Charlotte Ravenshire was pushed into the dark. She came back in the light. And that is the only ending that was ever going to make sense. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. That matters more than you know. Stay safe, stay kind, and may every story in your own life turn, in its own time, toward the light. Until next time, to thank you.